My thoughts are with Israel. I want to read you a poem, and it was first read publicly 54 years ago today. It's actually a song. The first three verses of the song were written by Naomi Shemer and sung by Shuli Natan at the Israel Music Festival on May 15th, 1967, shortly before the Six-Day War of June. Only 3 weeks later, the Israel Defense Forces captured the eastern part of Jerusalem and the Old City from the Jordanians. It is called the Jerusalem of Gold. The mountain air is clear as wine, and the scent of pines is carried on the breeze of twilight with the sound of the bells. And in the slumber of trees and stone, captive in her dream, the city that sits solitary, and in its midst is a wall. Jerusalem of gold and of copper and of light, behold, I am a violin for all your songs. How the cisterns have dried, the marketplace is empty, and no one frequents the Temple Mount in the old city. And in the caves in the mountains, winds are howling, and no one descends to the Dead Sea by way of Jericho. But as I come to sing to you today, and to adorn crowns to you, to tell your praise, I am the smallest of the youngest of your children, the least worthy of doing so, and of the last poet of all of the poets born. For your name scorches the lips like the kiss of an angel, if I forget thee, Jerusalem, which is all gold. At the time of Jerusalem being unified, Shemer wrote the final verses. When the old city was liberated from Jordanian rule, shofars indeed blew from the Temple Mount. We have returned to the cisterns, she wrote, to the market and to the marketplaces. A ram's horn calls out on the Temple Mount in the old city, and in the caves in the mountain, thousands of suns shine. We will once again descend to the Dead Sea by way of Jericho, Jerusalem of gold. I love Jerusalem. I love Israel. But we are not the only ones who cherish the spiritually gilded city. From the beauty of the lush Golan and Galilee to the desert blooms of the Negev, spring in Israel is wonderful. This week, though, the rain has turned to rockets, the bird calls to sirens. You have seen the news reports of Hamas rocket attacks and Israel's responses. Thousands of rockets have been launched at civilian targets across Israel, including Tel Aviv. They are indiscriminate volleys launched with the hope of hitting anything, killing anyone, damaging anything within Israel is what Hamas is doing. At the moment, so many rockets have been launched by Hamas simultaneously, it has even overwhelmed the Iron Dome system, which has proven itself as an incredible defensive system. It is just one example of what has been created with the partnership between the U.S. and Israel. We've seen pictures of the night sky streaked by rockets flying into Israel. And we have seen pictures of Israel's counteroffensive. We have read reports of Israel's precise counterattacks, which force them into civilian areas where Hamas hides launchers and fighters and bunkers, and too many people have died. Too many people have died. I have stood here before and spoken about Israel's practice of announcing raids with time for civilians to leave buildings. I have shared how Israel sometimes drops flyers or broadcasts impending attacks and goes to great lengths to avoid civilian injuries and deaths. Hamas knows it has the upper hand. Hamas knows with each Palestinian killed in an Israeli attack, the world's sympathy sways towards it. Because it knows it cannot win a direct confrontation with Israel, it hides itself behind the human shields of women and children. And none of this is new. None of that explains how we got here, or more importantly, how we might move forward. We have heard the quote, which is commonly misattributed to Albert Einstein, that insanity is doing the same thing over and over again and expecting different results. Whoever actually said that, the point is still important. We are stuck in a seamless, endless cycle of doing the same thing over and over again and expecting different results. Daniel Hartman wrote a powerful piece this week in the Times of Israel. Hartman is a leading thinker on issues surrounding Judaism and Israel. He and scholars from the Hartman Institute often come to our area in partnership with the Jewish Federation, and I encourage you to participate in any of these events. Hartman titled the piece, "I Cannot Just Put My Anger Aside Until Things Are Quiet." He begins, "I am angry. I am angry that Hamas which wants me dead and my country dismantled, is able to attack again and again with impunity at the time of their choosing, to inflict pain and suffering, and to shape the discourse between Israelis and the Palestinians, and now between Israeli Jews and Israeli Arabs. When our cities are being attacked, Israelis killed, and our life upended, protocol requires that we concentrate on condemning the actions of our enemies and unite around our right to live and to be a free people in our home." And Hartman says, "I've accepted this protocol for most of my life." He says, "I remember as a tank commander fighting in the 1982 Lebanon War, my anger at the protesters back home who were condemning the war. 'Not now,' I shouted," Hartman says, "as if I felt their delegitimization undermining my resolve, a resolve I needed to hold on to in order to stay alive and get through the day." Part of me still accepts this protocol. It is important for me to reaffirm that I know that this latest attack has nothing to do with the Damascus Gate or Sheikh Jarrah or the police entering the Dome of the Rock Mosque. Hamas brilliantly manipulated these events to grab hold of the mantle of Palestinian leadership from the PA, he writes, at the time when their ability to do so through the ballot has been denied them due to the yet again postponed Palestinian elections, Hartman says. And he continues, "It is important to reaffirm the validity of the Israeli narrative that Hamas, like Hezbollah and Iran, will only be satisfied when the last Jew is either in the Mediterranean Sea or back in Europe from where you came. We are at war with an enemy devoid of basic moral standards, a terrorist organization for whom any suffering of their citizens is legitimate so long as some Jewish blood is spilled. For Hamas," he writes, "victory is measured by the extent of pain they can extract and not by any strategic advancement they achieve for their people." But Hartman also continues that he is angry that Israeli society has not done the deeper work to move forward either. He continues, "Since most Israelis believe that there is no peace partner, we have removed the peace process from our public and policy agendas. But why have we removed all discourse about our moral responsibilities towards the Palestinians from these agendas? We offered and they said no is the accepted narrative, and consequently all suffering they may experience is their own responsibility. Released from any responsibility, we are exempt from blame," he writes. "Criticism of Israel is either anti-Semitic when done by others or betrayal when voiced by fellow Jews," he says. "We stand dismayed at Israeli-Arab protests, bemoaning the loss of a decade of coexistence work. We feel betrayed by them for siding with Hamas, our archenemy, and yet we have done almost no real, scalable, and sustainable work of coexistence. Job creation that will help the Israeli economy, yes. Coexistence, genuine respect, understanding where they are coming from and how they experience reality," Hartman says no. Daniel Hartman's words rang true to me as he pushes us to look beyond the immediacy of another round of skirmishes, a round of conflict leaving millions in shelters and fearful, and too many have already died. Israel must defend itself, period. And Hamas is determined to destroy Israel, period. And the only way to move forward is for Palestinians and Arabs more broadly to accept Israel's existence, because Israel's not disappearing, period. But as Hartman suggests, this does not dispel Israel's moral responsibilities towards its own citizens. The riots of Israelis against Israelis, Israeli Jews and Israeli Arabs in Lot or Yaffo or Jerusalem or Tel Aviv, Ramlah, and up north show the deep division within Israel proper. I spoke to someone who grew up at Bethel and now lives in Tel Aviv. She said that there was a neighborhood text that was going around with rumors that Arab protesters were coming through her neighborhood. And while it did not materialize, her fear was real. And Jewish groups roaming streets to beat up Arabs or celebrating as a fire occurred on the Temple Mount. The abyss within Israeli society between Israeli Jews and Israeli Arabs is real. They do not support Hamas, but they are simultaneously protesting against the neglect of Israeli society and government policies. Israel is confronted on simultaneous fronts, the Gaza border, as well as internal. Here in the U.S., our own divisions in the Jewish community make this even more complicated for us. The left wing of the Democratic Party spews vitriol about Israel and excuses Hamas terrorist activities. It denies Hamas's actions and has created a safe harbor for the meeting of hatred for Israel and the hatred of Jews. And while I could read from the congressional statements on the House floor from Thursday night as elected officials spoke both in support of Israel's right to defend herself and others calling Israel an apartheid state, those incorrect and dangerous characterizations of Israel affect our youth as well. Just this past week at Whitman High School, the Whitman Jewish Student Union posted a picture out of concern which surprised and shocked me. They took a picture and shared it with the school administration and others who quickly responded. It was a picture of Whitman students in the parking lot with a poster, an Israeli flag equals a Nazi swastika. Right here in our own community. Disgusting. Historically wrong, emotionally wrong, spiritually wrong. We cannot be locked into the cycle of we offered and they said no. It is destructive to our own moral being. We are acting against our own welfare by continuing in this way. Israeli society is weaker because we keep expecting different results from the same actions. American Jewry is weaker because of these moral quagmires. Hartman concludes his piece, there are parts of the narrative we cannot control. The reality is that with enemies like Hamas and Hezbollah, peace is impossible. He says, but I am angry that we are not striving to be better, smarter, more just, more hopeful, more visionary. He says, I am angry because over and over again we choose the narratives that contribute to our moral mediocrity and elevate a bad and unsustainable status quo. I cannot put this anger aside until tomorrow, he says. Our destiny is to always have to pay a price for our existence. Our responsibility is to strive for greatness within this destiny. Daniel Hartman wrote a brave and honest reflection on the internal work necessary as Israel simultaneously fights off the rockets and terror attacks from Gaza and faces its own internal moral dimensions. At this moment, we stand with Israel as she fights Palestinians who are determined and dedicated to the destruction of Israel, which I believe is not all Palestinians, but they are the leadership in Gaza. Hamas has hijacked Palestinian society. The Arab nations, Israel, and the Palestinians themselves must decide that Hamas's strategy of conflict does not gain them statehood or peace or security. It is clear that that is not Hamas's goal, though. Their stated goal is the removal of Israel entirely. Israel is in a moment of crisis, and we must respond. I stand with Israel. I fear for friends and Bethel families who are there living in Israel and some fighting in the IDF. And our support must be more than words. It must be tangible as well. And so Bethel is starting an Israel emergency campaign to support Magen David Adom. Magen David Adom is Israel's equivalent of the Red Cross. MDA are first responders to medical emergency for Israelis, Jews and Arabs and Christians and Druze, anyone. Their work is critical for all Israelis during crisis and each and every day. The last time Bethel did this, we were able to raise enough money to purchase an ambulance for Magen David Adom. I imagine hundreds of lives were touched by that ambulance, and many, many lives saved by the quick response and aid given to by those paramedics. And MDA does not care about creed or race or place of origin. If you are in need, they are the ones who respond. And information about this emergency campaign will be sent out to the community shortly, but I know now that people can donate on the Bethel website. And under the giving section, you can designate the Israel Fund at the synagogue. Jerusalem of gold. Jerusalem of gold. I stand with you. I pray for your safety for all your residents. I pray this conflict ends soon and we find a different way forward, because it is insanity to repeat the same thing over and over again, expecting different results.